Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. For today's episode, we spoke with our friend Brian McLaren. To give a little background to those listeners who haven't heard from Brian before, he's an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. A former college English teacher and pastor, Brian is a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He's a faculty member of the Living School and podcaster with Learning How to See, which are part of the Center for Action and Contemplation. As we mentioned a few episodes back, we've been planning a few conversations on the Bible as we study it this year. For Brian, as for many Christians, his relationship with the Bible itself has been an integral part of his faith journey, and we wanted to hear how that relationship has changed over time, how he reads it differently than he did when he was younger, and how he sees that sometimes people abuse the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, and where he continues to find beauty in it. Brian explained how much of the Christian world arrived at biblical inerrancy, and why we need not just a retranslation but reinterpretation. He also talked about the beauty in the Bible's unique creation story, and how we can avoid the Bible becoming what Brian refers to as a genocide card in your back pocket. He even gave us thoughts on a famous Book of Mormon story, but you'll have to listen to the episode to find out which one. Thanks as always for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Brian McLaren as much as we did.
Okay, Brian McLaren, thank you so much for coming back and joining us on the podcast.
So happy to be with good friends again.
Yeah, it's always our pleasure. For this conversation, obviously this is a theme that we're sort of covering to relatively great extent this year, about the Old Testament and the Bible as we move through it as a sort of worldwide church. We thought that you would bring a really interesting perspective as someone coming from more traditional American Christianity, evangelical Christianity. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, sort of to set the table here, if it's okay, is many Latter-day Saints may not be familiar with that traditional Christian evangelical view of the Bible, at least
Yes.
within American Christianity. And I don't necessarily know all the nuances, but could you sort of explain how important the Bible is to a typical evangelical congregation, and
Sure.
how important is inerrancy and all of that?
Yes. In fact, if it's okay, maybe I could just do a little historical framing for it.
Please.
So first, let me say, I grew up in what many people would call fundamentalism, other people would call evangelicalism. But really, to understand it, I think if we go back about 500 years, a little more than 500 years, to the Protestant Reformation, if we go back and say, listen, for the Catholic Church in Europe in the 1400s and for centuries before, truth was determined by the church, and the church meant the church hierarchy. And the term in Catholicism for this was the magisterium, which means the Bible is a key part of that, but the Bible has to be interpreted by the Pope and the cardinals and the tradition. And there was this sense, in fact, it was a word that they used, the authorities. These were the people who've established authoritative interpretations of the Bible for all of these centuries. Come to 1517, and this young German Catholic monk named Martin Luther stands up and says, I think the church is wrong about a whole lot of things. They're selling indulgences. They're letting people buy their way out of hell or purgatory. And this doesn't sound right. And so what Martin Luther does is he says, I can legitimately critique the church using the Bible to critique the church. So what he needs to do is he needs to, in a sense, take down the authority of the church a couple notches. And the way he does that is by lifting up the authority of the Bible. And his phrase was sola scriptura. It's only the Bible that has ultimate authority. We can use the Bible to critique the church. And so that happens roughly just a little after 1500. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and the Protestant churches, for example, John and Charles Wesley, who were the founders of Methodism, one of the largest denominations in the United States, they said, well, listen, when we interpret the Bible is one of our basic authority structures, but we also have to interpret the Bible in light of the tradition and in light of scripture, in light of reason and in light of experience. So he had what they called the quadrilateral, or like a table with four legs: scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. So that becomes a major stream in Protestantism until the 20th century. And after Charles Darwin in the mid 1800s and Karl Marx and all of these challenges come to that Christianity feels like atheism is at our door. And so Protestant Christians, especially in the United States in the early 20th century, articulated something they called the fundamentals. 5 beliefs that they said, if you don't hold to these 5 beliefs, you are not a real Christian. And we are the true Christians. We hold these 5 beliefs. And one of them was the inerrancy of Scripture. And what was in their minds is the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve must be taken literally. And this means you cannot believe evolution. So that's where this term inerrancy becomes a really big deal for the stream of Christianity that I grew up in. And this affects everybody. Only about somewhere around 16 or 17% of Americans attend white evangelical churches on a regular basis. But between 25 and 30% of Americans identify as evangelical. Largely, that's become a political identifier lately, as well as a religious one. But this biblical literalism and inerrancy, you have to interpret the Bible literally and believe it's correct in everything that it says, then that's deeply embedded with a significant percentage of the American population. And that's how I grew up. Sorry for that long history lesson.
That's really helpful. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So what would be the typical approach to contradictions inside the Bible itself with this worldview?
The Bible has no contradictions inside this worldview. It cannot.
Oh, okay.
Because the phrase that's used is the Bible has verbal plenary inspiration. Verbal means every single word, and plenary means the whole thing. Every word and the whole thing of the Old and New Testaments are inspired and therefore inerrant. Now, this is what virtually all evangelicals would believe. There's a minority that questions it, and they have sort of loopholes to get around it. Interestingly, Roman Catholics have not been required to believe this, but there is a growing stream of conservative Roman Catholics who start to sound a lot like evangelical Protestants. And then what people often call mainline Protestants, Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Lutherans, those different denominations, they would be more like what I described from Charles Wesley. Well, you have Scripture, it's an authority, but you interpret it in the context of reason, tradition, and experience, which means, which means you might challenge some things in the Bible. You still respect the Bible, but you don't believe it's inerrant, and you could talk about contradictions and differences in the biblical text in those contexts. Yeah.
So how does someone that holds to inerrancy deal with the concept of translation? So like, is there a particular translation that's taken to be inerrant, and the other translations that interpret things a little bit differently are not? Or like, how do you do that? Because obviously, I assume you're not all reading the Hebrew Bible, right, or whatever.
Oh my goodness. So listen, when I was a boy, I remember hearing sermons that the King James Version, the version that's in Elizabethan English from the early 1600s, that was the only legitimate translation, because new translations were coming out that were more accurate, but that showed some of these inherent tensions or contradictions, whatever you want to call them, and we had to keep those at bay. And by the way, I should say the reason we had to keep those at bay is because, I would imagine Latter-day Saints have versions of this, but because Protestants broke away from Catholics, there's a certain sense that for 500 years, Protestants have been insecure about their legitimacy and have to continually prove that they're legitimate. And so I'll throw in one other little historical thing for historical nerds out there. So the Protestants come along early 1500s, and and they say that Scripture is the highest authority. It took about 100 years, but the Catholic Church then needed to respond to that because a lot of people were leaving Catholicism and becoming Protestants. And in the early 1600s, there was something called the Council of Trent, and Catholic leaders got together and they said, the Bible isn't inerrant. The leadership of the church is inerrant. And that's when the doctrine of something called the infallibility of the Pope became articulated by Catholics. So each of them said, we have a perfect inerrant authority that everybody has to believe. And you can see why Protestants then, to uphold their legitimacy, many of them feel they have to have an inerrant authority. And it's, you can see how Protestants and Catholics arguing about whose authority is better, the Pope and the other traditions of the church, or the Bible itself. You could see the more they argue about that, the more they reaffirm the idea that you have no authority unless your authority is inerrant.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I can tell you a little bit about our parallels and sort of within the hierarchy of authority. So like we have the Bible, and there's an article of faith, which is a few sentences written by Joseph Smith that says, we believe the Bible to be the word of God as far as it is translated correctly. So we've got that little sort of like out,
Yes.
We also believe the Book of Mormon to be the word of God. There's also within the Book of Mormon, it says that many plain and precious things were removed from the Bible. And so we sort of like hold them side by side and say, they sort of complement and explain each other.
Yes.
But then we have a greater authority, which is the leaders of our church we consider to be modern day prophets. And so what they say, over time and together in unison sort of supersedes anything that we get out of the scriptures, if that makes sense.
And you can see then all these same elements are at play. The Bible, tradition, and tradition includes the sort of leadership structure of the church, having this sort of almost like legal precedence to say, this is one of our pronouncements 500 years ago or 100 years ago, and here's another one that we're adding to that now. And then the big question for people is, how does reason and experience come in? So reason, and this is where the issue of evolution was just a groundbreaking issue for American evangelicals and fundamentalists, because people would say, look, I see the fossil record here. All the data seems to say that the earth is very old and developed over millions of years. And you're telling us it's 6,000 years old and happened in 6 days, because we have to take this literally. By the way, if I could just add one other dimension of this, that I think all of our religious traditions have struggled to take seriously, and that is the issue of interpretation. And maybe this is part of what Joseph Smith was trying to get at, but it's not just how we translate from one language to another, but how we translate meaning from one historical and social and cultural context to another. And of course, that opens up a big can of worms. Yeah.
So I'm still thinking about what you just said about inerrancy and infallibility. And I'm wondering, because this is something that you kind of opened up for me in Faith After Doubt. Do you think that inerrancy and infallibility themselves actually would stunt our spiritual growth? Like, even if we could be gifted inerrancy and know for sure that something was perfect, or infallibility and know that it was perfect, do you think that would even actually be good for our spirituality?
It's a really great question. So let me answer it very plainly, and then I'll complicate it a little bit.
Okay.
I think it would not be good for our spirituality. I think it would not be good. And the reason I say that is, first of all, whoever determines how to interpret the text, or whoever is standing as the representative, the question is, who can hold them accountable if they're the ones who have the power to interpret or reinterpret a text? In other words, this gives an awful lot of power to human beings who could use that power against their opponents, or who could make a mistake, right? Now, what this means then is the Catholic Church basically has taught that God would never let the Pope and cardinals make a mistake. So I guess people could have faith that that's the case, but what if they make a mistake? You've just entrusted an awful lot of power to a group of people. And in a sense, you've taken away your own right to think for yourself. That doesn't seem to me to be good for people. And I would just say, historically, it hasn't worked out too well because people have used that power in really hurtful ways. For example, those same Protestant Christians who are claiming that the Bible was infallible, when slavery came along, used the Bible to justify continuing slavery. Meanwhile, other Christians use the Bible to say it's time for us to throw slavery away. But you can see each group by saying we're quoting the Bible. If people are quoting the Bible to say opposite things, we got problems. But the other thing that comes to my mind, Aubrey, that as you all are grappling with this, and this is my opinion, obviously, as with everything I say, feel free to disagree with it, but I don't think an infallible or an inerrant text is possible. I don't think it's possible because every text is written in language. And if you take something that's absolutely clear today, I can pretty much guarantee in 1,000 years, the world will have changed enough that it will require not only translation, but it will require interpretation and reapplication. And this is another reason that the whole idea of an inerrant text, it seems to me, is problematic. Now, as I said, this is what I was brought up with, but part of my own growing up process forced me to have to question a whole lot of these assumptions. So do you see what I'm saying when I say, I don't even think it's possible?
Yeah.
Somebody always has to interpret it. And man, you're giving somebody a whole lot of power to give them the keys of interpretation to a text that's supposedly infallible or inerrant.
Yeah. It seems like in many ways, this is actually a question, like a question of development, in terms of, Fowler or Wilbur or any of these types of thinkers, right? Like it is very natural, I think, in the early stages of faith, childhood in particular, to like say, just give it to me, like I'll absorb it.
Yes.
And it's difficult, in some cases, impossibly difficult, depending on your yes. context, I think, to get into a place where your own reason and experience can become your primary indicator of morality. And yes. and I think that obviously the danger there is throwing out everything yes. else. I mean, in all of these developmental frameworks, it's important not to just transcend, but to transcend and include everything that came before, right?
That's so well said. So well said. Yeah.
And so I'm curious, maybe with that in mind, could you tell us a little bit more about your later journey with the Bible? Like you sort of alluded to how you took it as a child and a young person. How has your journey progressed throughout the rest of your life with yes. the Bible in mind?
So let me just speak for myself here. I remember at some point early on, this is going to sound cynical. I don't mean this in a cynical way, but I remember thinking, religion's kind of like a game and you got to learn the rules. And in my religion, the only way you can get anywhere is to show how the Bible agrees with what you're trying to say, or how you're just restating what the Bible says. So in a sense, you become a little bit like a lawyer. A lawyer takes a constitutional amendment and a precedent from a case in this year and constructs an argument. Well, the way you got anything done in my religious context was by arguing Bible verses. And I became pretty good at that, Yeah. And I use the Bible, I hope, to stretch things in the direction of more compassion and more justice and more empathy and more kindness, because that seemed to me like the right thing to do. And so that's how I played the game. But I remember when I became a pastor at a relatively young age. So I was leading a congregation. And I was trying to use the Bible in a helpful way to do the best I could for a lot of people. But I remember when the first inklings sort of, creep up the back of your neck and you think, oh no, maybe the rules of this game themselves are flawed. In other words, I can be sure that I'm using the Bible to try to take us in a better direction. but maybe the whole method of using the Bible to be the thing that proves your point. What if there's a problem with that? And I remember that was sort of the first place where I started having questions about this. And
was that a really scary moment for you? No, obviously it's more than a moment, but yeah.
Yeah, super scary, because it was permissible in my religious community to disagree about things, but you couldn't disagree that the way you're going to solve your disagreements is by an appeal to a verse of the Bible. Romans 12:3 says this. Yeah, but 2 Corinthians, well, Galatians 2, this can put these two together. And so it was, very complex argument. And I would imagine you all have similar, I think every religious tradition has similar kinds of struggles. And what that forced me to do is ask the question, what is the Bible? What is the Bible for? Are the rules of this game, do they even make sense within the Bible itself? And that was both a terrifying thought, but a phenomenally liberating thought, that maybe, if I could say it this way, because, in evangelical context like mine, the worst thing you can say about anything is that's unbiblical.
Right.
Okay.
But there's a certain sense that what I started to think is maybe the way we use the Bible is unbiblical.
Oh, that's funny. Was that a huge heresy that you just shared with us?
Well, a lot of scholars were saying something like that. But what you find out is that if you raise certain questions, people edge you toward the door.
Yeah. So what would you say then is the overall thesis that you've come up with? I mean, obviously keeping open room for even more development and more growth. But what that question that you started asking yourself, what is the Bible? What's the answer to that you've sort of settled on for now?
Okay. So let me make an analogy, and no analogy is perfect, right? My mother died several years ago, but my mother was a great keeper of photographs. She always had a camera out, and before, she always used her phone for pictures, but before her phone, it was a little Instamatic and a Polaroid and things that a lot of people will remember. She took thousands and thousands of pictures, and she took pictures of me, from the time I was a baby. Her pictures told me things about myself that I had no way of knowing if she hadn't taken those pictures. And there were people's faces who I would never know who they were, except she took a picture. And later I'd say, who's that? She'd say, that's your second cousin, Phil. And now I know who that person is. So if you think her photograph collection is if I want to understand myself, I need that, right? And then there's also pictures that came from before I was born of her childhood and her young adulthood. And so I know who I am largely because of my mother's photographs. And so I take them very, very seriously. And that's the way I would describe how I see any tradition's scriptures. They're part of our legacy. Now, my mother, especially in her later age, she wasn't perfect in her memory. So I might say, what happened in this? I don't recognize these people. She might not have remembered the right name. She might have been wrong about some things, but that doesn't make me throw out the photographs. I'm still glad to have them. They're mementos, and they help me know things I know in no other way. So I look at the Bible as this collection of, it's like a scrapbook. And one of the most important things with the Bible is not just one thing. It's not just photographs. It's also like my mother saved pictures I drew that, when I was a little kid, some of my early art, loosely using that term very loosely. I went through a stage where I loved to read comic books, and I started writing comic books and drawing pictures and having those little bubbles with words. She saved those. She saved my report cards from school. So all the things that she saved, that's part of what I have to know, right? And the thing about the Bible is a collection of different genres of literature. There's poetry, there is history, there is philosophy, there's law, there's all different types of things. And there are some things that we aren't sure what they are, you know. So for example, and this is one of the places where my fundamentalist evangelical background got me in trouble. When we were told the Bible was inerrant and we had to read it literally, it meant we had to read everything as fact, historical, scientific fact. But when I grew older, even as a teenager, and I thought the theory of evolution makes way more sense than having to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old and created in 6 literal days, I thought, well, maybe the mistake is a mistake of genre. Maybe those first few chapters of Genesis, it's not that they're trying to be science and history and they fail. Maybe they're trying to be something else and we're making a mistake to interpret them as science and history. And then I learned that there's this genre of creation stories or origin myths or creation narratives, and they exist across cultures. And maybe what I should say is these narratives or stories aren't meant to be taken literally as fact. They have a purpose, and I need to try to understand their purpose. So that's one of the things I'd say is this great treasury of the Bible is all literature, but different genres of literature, is a set of documents and literary artifacts that are precious, but we have to understand what they are and what they were doing in their original context and let them be what they are.
I think
so. Is there something about that collection, like that scrapbook, that is still holy to you? You know, that sets it apart from other good books? If you lose literalism, like if you lose inerrancy, like is there something that makes this book a living book?
So let me. So if I were to step back and say, I believe that God can speak to people through this text, or I believe that people can make contact with God and this text helps them, I would say if that's what makes something holy, I would say, yeah, I think so. But here's the thing that I never would have said growing up as a conservative, white, evangelical, Protestant Christian, and we could add a whole bunch of other things, right? I never would have said that anyone could, that Hindus could ever have any legitimate contact with the holy through the Bhagavad Gita and the Rig Veda. I would never be able to say that Muslims are making contact with anything holy or sacred through the Quran. So all of those, you know, I had to be, what I was taught is to consider the Bible holy. I had to be a biblical supremacist, meaning I had to say the Bible was right and everything else was wrong if it wasn't saying exactly what the Bible said. What I've come to see now is, and again, this is just my opinion and people can feel free to differ with it, but every piece of literature arises to meet a need in its original context. And it's part of it has a milieu, it has a native environment. And if we want to understand it, we have to put it in its context. And one way to say it is everybody is at a starting point, and what they wrote down in whatever year was helping them solve problems that they really had. And so I'm not so interested in saying, was their solution right? I'm interested in saying, how did this help them solve their problem? Because if I'm honest, it might have helped them solve that problem, and then it might create a new problem. And I could give you tons of examples of that, but that helps me read it empathetically with, you know, and look for something holy and good that's unfolding. They were trying to improve. They were given this document, and now they're trying to improve on that document with this document. I can see that's really a big improvement. And I can celebrate that.
I'm super curious. I mean, I think that framework is immensely valuable and helpful. I'm curious if we could maybe walk through an example. Maybe we could use for example, the Genesis story, the creation story, Adam and Eve, and say, because I think that one's such an easy one, you know, for questioners and scientifically minded people to throw out, because, you know, we have a scientific explanation for maybe not all of creation going all the way back, but for at least for the
Yeah.
creation of humankind and how, biologically things have come into being.
Yes.
So like, does that story still have power explaining something about our origins and who we are and our relationships? And, if so, like, what is that? How would you dive into that?
Oh boy, what a great question. So look, I want to, if I'm so glad we can talk about this. So first, let me start by quoting a rabbi friend of mine. Her name is Stephanie Colin. She's a rabbi in New York City. And Stephanie said to me once, something about you Christians that makes no sense to us Jews. She said, you're always trying to find the one right interpretation of the Bible. She said, that sounds so disrespectful to us. To us, the Bible is valuable because it's a bottomless well of meaning and inspiration. Isn't that great?
Wow.
So the idea that you would try to reduce it to one meaning is so disrespectful. The more meanings it generates, we see that as showing how valuable it is. So let me give you 3 or 4 just off the top of my head, ways to read Genesis. So one really interesting one is to take Genesis and put it in the genre of creation narratives. And if anybody wanted to do this, you could have so much fun. Go on Google, go online and just put in your search engine, creation narratives. And you'll find a Navajo creation narrative and a Potawatomi creation narrative and a Yoruba creation narrative. Like there are, I don't know how many thousands we have, from around the world. But the ancient Jews would have had a very popular one in their part of the world would have been the Assyrian creation narrative, or I'm sure there were many, but an Assyrian creation narrative. And there was this narrative that was about this ancient family of gods who were the only things that existed. And one was named Tiamat. And Tiamat was like a giant crocodile. And you can imagine why people could make fun of that, right? Like we could hear people mocking those primitive people. But think about it. A crocodile is one of the most powerful things that people would ever encounter, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, but it's powerful and it's a little bit dangerous because reality is a little bit dangerous. So you can see why they would say that's a great symbol for one of the gods of the universe. So I forget even at this moment, forget some of the details, but what happens is there's a fight among this family of gods. And one of the gods takes Tiamat. In fact, I think it's one of Tiamat's sons. Tiamat's a female god, as I recall, and takes the top jaw and the bottom jaw and rips Tiamat in half. And one half of Tiamat becomes the earth, and the other half of Tiamat becomes the sky, and the blood of Tiamat is used. Blood clots. I mean, this is gross, but this is what it said. The blood clots are made into human beings.
Wow.
So, boy, now, if you take that as your story, what do you say about the universe? The universe is about chaos. The universe is about conflict. The universe is about violence. And we are the product of chaos and violence. And that's where we find ourselves. And I can see how that story would help people think, yeah, this is a bloody, messy world out there. And we got thrown into the middle of it. And it was bloody and messy before we got here. And here we are trying to make our way through it, right? Read the biblical story. And what happens? It doesn't start with a family of gods having fights. It starts with one God saying, but interestingly, let us make. There's almost this sense of a community saying, how about we make a beautiful earth, and it's all good and it's all peaceful. Nobody gets killed to make anything. There's no bloodshed. The world is good. Human beings then create bloodshed. Now, if you just take that story, that Hebrew story, put it in conversation with the Assyrian story, I can say, here's how the Jewish people were taking the dominant story of their time and are saying that story is not good enough. We need a better story than that, right? So let me give 2 others real quick. I won't take as much time with that, but another dominant force in the world for the ancient Jewish people were the Egyptians. And when you think of the Egyptians, you think about the pharaohs. And when you think about a pharaoh, you think about the headdress that the pharaoh wears. And what's on the front of the pharaoh's headdress? A serpent, a cobra, a cobra. So let's imagine that you have people who are poor peasants living in the Palestinian hill country, and they have this empire that's rich and powerful and with big weapons. And you think, and they have a lot of gold and a lot of wealth and power. And you think, why are they so much more powerful than us? And you tell a story, well, it's because they got deceived. That's not the way to live. When you live that way, you have slaves and you exploit people and you oppress people. We're sure glad that we have our story about how we live and not their story of snakes and empires and power and violence and murder, right? You can just totally see those stories interacting.
Yeah.
One more quick one that modern psychologists take, and they say, look, and what they're doing is they're saying, let's not even think of this as a story about history. Let's think about this as a story about biography. And isn't it true that we all start as innocent children and the world is a garden and it's a safe place? And then we discover there's danger in this safe place. How are we going to deal with this danger? And we start wanting to be able to master the danger and become more knowledgeable and powerful. And so they would read the Genesis story and say, this isn't telling us about history. This is telling us about how all of us start as innocent. And then as we mature, we have to deal with the complexities and difficulties and dangers of life. And we lose our innocence. And now we have to make our way in the world. So I can look at those three different ways of reading the biblical text and think, that story in Genesis, and think, each of them is fascinating, and we could do 25 more. There's an incredible anthropologist named René Girard. He offers this incredible reading of the Genesis story as a story about violence and how violence enters the human world. And oh my gosh, so many different approaches.
So it's so interesting because it just feels like you can almost learn more about the people interpreting the story than you can. I mean, that's almost more valuable than the story. It's just like what we need to believe about the story says a lot more about us than the story says about God, maybe. So how do you
It's interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I just want to know, do you worry that when we have total freedom to interpret that do we just kind of lose our anchor and we're going to start really just creating God in our image over and over again in every generation?
So first of all, what a $1 million question. Part of me doesn't even want to answer it, but we should end the podcast there and just let people think about that question for a week, because seriously, here's the fact. People do that. People reinterpret God so that God hates the same people they hate, loves the same people they love. We reinterpret God so God legitimizes however I want to make money. I mean, we remake God so that question itself. And what's really interesting is, to me, this is one of the things I love about the Bible. When I stopped having to read the Bible as this sort of rule book or as this law book that we have arguments by quoting this verse and that verse and argue with each other, I said, well, what do we see unfolding in the biblical story? And what I think we end up with is we see people's thinking maturing over time. But here's where it gets really interesting. If I just step back, then I can judge everybody and say, those people were so immature, But if I say, but hold it, I'm no different. I am part of this story. And so just as my ancestors had to take what they were given and decide, where are the parts of the story that are failing? What do we need next? What's the next step in the conversation? This is why I like to say the Bible isn't a law book. The Bible is a library. And the value of a library is not that it tells you what to think, but the value of a library is that it teaches you how to think by showing you the history of people changing their thinking. And if I could give just a quick example. If you start in the book of Genesis, what religion are Adam and Eve? Well, they have no religion. They're just people. There's no temple. There's no holy book. There's no language. There's no writing, right? They have this sort of primal hunter-gatherer existence. And then what happens? Well, then you have the patriarchs, and Abraham comes along. When Abraham comes along, there's no Bible, there's no temple, there's no rituals. It's just a patriarch, right? So it's a patriarchy. So you go from this sort of hunter-gatherer nature life to a patriarchy. But guess what happens after a while? The patriarchy grows so big that they need laws. And so under Moses, they're given laws. Oh, then you see, and law helps you a whole lot. But guess what? Once you have laws, everybody thinks they're fine. The prophets come along and say, I don't care how many laws you have, you still aren't taking care of the poor. You're oppressing people. Your laws aren't worth anything if you treat people badly. And so the prophets critique the law. And then into that, other prophets come along, and Jesus comes along, and Jesus says, hey, you guys, law is great, but it's not the be all and end all. And the prophets' concern for justice is really, really great. You know what we really need around here is we need love. Love is the greatest commandment. And then Paul comes along and he says, yeah, love's really what it's all about. And so you see this progression. Oh, but I left that one stage in there. You've got the philosophers like in the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, which I think is a work of philosophy. And they are coming along saying it's important for us to reflect and to think critically. And so all of these voices contribute to us today. And we say, what would happen if we let the Bible tell us there's a place for sort of indigenous wisdom, and there's a place for law, and there's a place for philosophy, and there's a place for the prophetic or the social justice orientation. And the Bible gave that to us. And overall, is love is the most important thing. And the Bible gave us that all along. That's how I see it. And I don't know now if I just totally not answered your question or not, but anyway.
Yes, no, that I love that. Like what a beautiful way to read the Bible. Like with that lens, I feel like that would solve so many of the problems that can be really uncomfortable, especially in the, as you get through the Old Testament. So thank you so much for that. And I feel like you've already answered the question, but I want to be so explicit about violence before we move on. Like, there's this awesome chapter that we loved in your book, The Great Migration, where you talk about the genocide card in your back pocket. And
yes,
that was, even just the chapter heading was so uncomfortable to read, because it forces you to kind of deal with this like hypothetical moral dilemma, which is like, what do you do if you really believe that this happened and that God said that an entire population should be destroyed? Like that really does leave this door open for it could happen again. And so you're faced with this hypothetical situation. Like, what would you do? Like, what would you do if if in your worldview that could happen again? So would you just maybe tell the story? Like, could you talk about speaking at the seminary and how this idea came out?
No, I'd love to tell that story. Yeah. So I was asked to speak at the seminary in the UK, and I had to take the subway and get a bus, and eventually made my way across the city. And I had to walk through this neighborhood to this evangelical Christian seminary. And I should say the neighborhood, if anyone's been to London, it's a very diverse city. And for probably 10 blocks walking there, the people were mostly from South Asia. So some of them were Pakistani and they were Muslim, and you could tell by their dress. And others were Indian and they were Hindu, and you could tell, and there were some Sikhs thrown in. And so I go through this neighborhood and I get to this school and I have dinner and then I give my lecture. And I just went off script. I don't know what I was supposed to be talking about, but I said, oh, and I should say this seminary had a big wall around it. And it wasn't too long after September 11, 2001. So the issue of religious violence was in all of our minds, right? And I said to the people, if I lived in the neighborhood around your school, the one thing I'd want to know about you all is whether you have a genocide card in your back pocket. And they all sort of look at me, and I, pull out a card to kind of make a credit card to make my point. I'd say, I'd want to know, are you at this seminary, do they teach you to read the Bible in such a way that at some point, based on the Bible, you would think it's God's will for you to go outside the walls of this seminary and kill some Muslims or kill some Hindus or kill some Sikhs or Buddhists or Jews or whatever? And everyone looked a little bit shocked that I would say such a thing. But the fact is, if we know our history, this has happened many, many times. I have a book coming out in May called Do I Stay Christian? And in one of the chapters, I just give a sampling of the violence that Christians have inflicted upon Jews through Christian history. I mean, books have been written and could be written about this, or the violence that Christians inflicted upon Muslims, right? And so here in the United States, people quoted the Bible to justify massacres of the Native Americans. And by the way, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the problems that the Book of Mormon was trying to solve, because I think, smart Mormons would have said the way that other Christians use the Bible to justify doing terrible things, isn't there some way we could imagine a relationship with the native peoples other than genocide? But the Bible
Absolutely.
has been used for genocide. And so I said, what do you think? And one student stands up and pulls out a card from his wallet and says, if the Bible has the genocide card, then I would be unfaithful to God to not hold the genocide card. In other words, he was saying, I believe that it's literally true that God told one group of people to go kill another group of people, men, women, children, and therefore it could happen again. God's allowed to do that, and I'm totally fine with it, And I just think that brought right to the surface for everybody there how significant the way we interpret the Bible is, because, lives are in the balance. And so much more we could say.
You say in the book that even though you believe that the young man that responded to you was dangerously wrong, that you were grateful for him for speaking up, because like it is a view that is held by so many people, even though we kind of like don't talk about that part a lot,
Exactly right.
And I'm curious, what is your approach then to reading the Bible? I mean, and there are problems that I would maybe love to get into in the Book of Mormon as well, along these lines. But when God appears to have commanded this to happen, how do you get around that?
Yes.
And what value could that possibly have?
Yeah, let me give you a short answer, and then, if it's okay, a little bit of a longer answer. So, sure. A short answer. This is a term, I don't know if you use this in the Latter-day Saints, but a lot of Christian theologians that I know use the term progressive revelation. And it's their way of saying, look, God works with people where they are and invites them to take the next step forward. And if they take that step forward, eventually they're going to need to take another step forward. So, for example, in the Bible where it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which basically says, and a life for a life. And a lot of people quote that to justify capital punishment. They don't seem terribly bothered that it tends to be Black people who get way more capital punishment than white people, and poor people who get way more capital punishment than rich people. All they care about is justifying it based on quoting that Bible verse, right? But if we go back and we realize that you can find ancient law codes from the time of the ancient Jewish people, where they said, if somebody knocks out one of your teeth, you can go knock out all of their teeth. Or if somebody kills your brother, you can go kill 10 of his brother. So you can see that text would be saying, look, stop doing 10 for 1. By the way, our former president, you might remember, his motto was, if somebody hits you, you hit them back 10 times as hard, right? There are a lot of people who still believe that. Yeah, you can become president and believe that. But this is saying, no, if somebody does something bad, you only pay back in kind. Interesting, you come later in the Bible. And Jesus says this, and Paul repeats it many times in the New Testament. Jesus says, if somebody hits you, don't hit them back 10 times as hard. Don't hit them back as hard. Turn the other cheek. Now, what is he saying? He's saying, look, I think what he's saying is, look, violence just creates some violence. Gandhi said, if we all say eye for an eye, soon everybody's blind. And so I think Jesus was saying, it's time for us now to take the next step. Let's stop tit for tat retaliation. Let's move beyond what many people call retributive violence, and let's move to retributive justice, and let's move to restorative justice. And instead of trying to think, how can I get back at that person? Let's think, how can we heal this situation so that this sort of violence and injustice doesn't happen? Now, I took too long on that, so maybe I shouldn't take time and give you a lengthier one, but I'll give you a quick example. If anyone wanted to read this in the New Testament, it's a fascinating story. It's in Matthew chapter 15. And I won't take all the time to explain all the details. I've written about this in a couple of my books. But it's this place where Jesus is on the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee, which was Gentile territory. And in fact, it would take so much time to tell the story. Let me just say it this way. He's at a place where the slaughter of the Canaanites had happened, where 7 tribes of Gentiles were slaughtered, according to the Bible, by Joshua and his people. Jesus is in that same area, and the people are hungry, and he feeds them. And when they're done, there are 7 baskets of food left over. And some biblical interpreters think, and by the way, some people might say, come on, that's so implausible that Jesus would multiply food. He multiplies a loaf and fish, and there's enough and 7 baskets left over. And some people say, I don't really believe it. Okay, let's say you don't believe it really happened. But even if it's just a fictional story, what would it mean? And what they've said is, whether it happened or not, could it be that the 7 baskets are evoking the 7 tribes that had been killed in this area? And could this be a way for Matthew to be saying, the way that we used to encounter the other was to slaughter them? What Jesus is telling us now is, let's feed each other. Let's feed the hungry. Let's care about each other. Let's move beyond violence and move toward nonviolence. So if the direction is toward nonviolence, that's how I deal with this. I look at those things and I say, that's what people thought a long time ago. But it's time for us to move beyond that.
Wow, that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm curious too. So there's an interesting case study potentially around this question in the Book of Mormon, where right at the beginning there's this family. They've been commanded by God to leave Jerusalem, and then God commands them, the sons in the family, to essentially go back and get what are called the brass plates. The brass plates are scripture. They contain genealogy, other important writings. And when it comes down to it, Nephi, the hero of the story, the only way to get the plates after so many attempts is to essentially kill the possessor of the plates, a man named Laban. And there's this really interesting internal dialogue that Nephi goes through and says, the Spirit constrained me to kill him. And I said, I've never shed any man's blood. And the Spirit says, you really need to do it. And the famous line is, it's better that one man should perish than that a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. And Nephi then sort of gathers his courage and smites off Laban's head and takes the plates, and they go on and flourish as a civilization based on that act for many centuries. And so there's some real conflict here morally, because I am very uncomfortable with the idea that I or anyone I know could be constrained or think they are constrained by the Spirit to kill me or my family. And I like the idea that my neighbors, no matter what spiritual prompting they think they receive, it's completely impossible that they would ever obey any voice that tells them to commit violence against any of our other neighbors. You know what I mean? Yes. At the same time, there is a certain logic to what Nephi goes through. If you take it from a utilitarian or a communitarian perspective, and say this really is for the greater good of a larger community of people. How do you deal with that? And I'm curious, you have fresh eyes on this. This has been debated ad nauseum within Mormonism. What are your reactions as I say those things?
Yes. So the first thing I would say is you're very fortunate that in the Book of Mormon, there's only that one major story of God commanding violence.
Well, that's the famous one.
That's the famous one. But because the truth is, if you read the Bible, and by the way, well, if you read the Bible, there is an awful lot of them.
Yeah.
And one of the most horrific being the story where God tells Abraham to kill his son Isaac. And you can just think of the number of psychotic people, and I don't mean psychotic as an insult, I mean it as a diagnosis, who are hearing voices and having hallucinations and have heard a voice tell them to kill their children. So that's the first thing I'd say. You're lucky that you don't have dozens and dozens of those stories. But the fact that there's even one could become a murder card that somebody keeps in their pocket. And this is why I think every tradition needs the ability to grow, which includes the ability to critique its sacred texts. And to say it would never, ever be right to use that text to justify killing someone. The text might be valuable because it would say, if good people want to justify killing somebody, they will do it in this way. And thank God they weren't justified. And thank God that he'd never killed anybody before. And thank God that he found it abhorrent to even kill somebody there. But let's be honest, whenever people kill somebody, they come up with a good reason to do it.
Wow.
And then what we might say is, and I'm going to guess that in the in the Mormon scriptures, in the Book of Mormon, you would be able to find other passages that really emphasize our need to be nonviolent and to work toward peace and to work toward reconciliation.
Absolutely.
And then I think it becomes an ethical imperative for people to say, based on these texts, we have to leave violence behind us. And here's the thing. I don't want to, I'm speaking for myself here, right? I don't want to be in the position of saying God told anybody to be hateful and violent and cruel and genocidal and all the rest. But it's true that an awful lot of people think God is that way. And so I want to take everything I read in the Bible and in the Book of Mormon and in the Bhagavad Gita and the Rig Veda and the Quran and all the other scriptures that people hold sacred. And I want to use them to remind myself how easy it is to do horrible things in God's name. And I want to take every one of them as a cautionary tale going forward, that I want to avoid that. Now, having said that, I want to say one other thing, just in the interest of pure honesty, right? We still are making decisions like this all the time. Like, for example, I'm a big believer in getting the COVID-19 vaccine. I'm sure some people aren't, right? But I have a friend I just had breakfast with, and he told me his best friend is against taking the vaccine because the vaccine has either killed some people or given them some long-term diseases. Well, everything I know about medicine tells me that our bodies are different enough that if you give, 2 billion people the same medicine, it's going to have a bad effect in some people. And then you're making decisions in order to save 60 million lives from dying from COVID. We're making the choice that, there's going to be unintended consequences of some people, getting sick or even dying, a very small minority. And that's why we have things like the Centers for Disease Control that try to make ethical decisions about what we allow to be taken. So in a sense, I could read that story and say, these are the moral dilemmas that we live with constantly. We make that decision every time we get in a car, because the odds are that of X million people who turn the key and drive their car, some of them are unintentionally going to kill somebody today, right? And it could be not through driving drunk or anything else. It's just accidents happen, right? And something could happen. And so we all live with those risks. But the great thing is, in the act of having this discussion about the text, if we walk away with it saying, yeah, there might come times where God gives me permission to kill somebody, the text has been abused. But if we come out of the discussion thinking, every day I want to get up and think, how can I live today to bring blessing to people and not harm? And that's my desire, which is the way you frame this, Tim. Wow. That's what we want to have happen.
I think that another natural conversation that stories like this, like problematic stories like this one and others in the Bible, that causes is for people to really get focused on historicity. Like, instead of grappling with what the story means, it's almost a relief to focus on like just deciding if the story itself is true or not true. And yes. I understand the energy around that. And I feel like in some ways it sort of relieves you of the wrestle. Like, if it's just not true, then like you can throw it all away. And so yes. I would love for you to talk about how you see, is it valuable? Are these stories valuable in and of themselves just as stories? Like, is it valuable to have stories in a canon with your community to wrestle with? And like, even if you put historicity or inerrancy aside, would there still be something there worth talking about all the time?
Yeah. Oh, another superb and important question. So maybe I can tell you a quick story about a friend who I met in speaking engagement, who's an atheist and brilliant atheist and author. His name is David Bodanis, and he wrote a wonderful book I love, I highly recommend, called E=mc², the biography of an idea. And if anyone wants to understand that equation, if you read this book, you will understand it. You will be so surprised that you actually understand it. It's so well written. So David is a writer, and we were both writers who were asked to speak at some event. And we just hit it off, and we've stayed in touch. And he has a book that he never published. I begged him to publish it. But as an atheist, he wanted to write a book about the 10 Commandments. It's kind of like his thing, right? E=mc², the 10 Commandments. Let's take something and try to make sense of it. And David, and he sent me the manuscript and said, Brian, I need to know how much this is going to piss off Christians. And so here's David's approach. He doesn't believe in God, but he's interested in the 10 Commandments. And he said, and I hope this won't, upset people too much, but there are an awful lot of scholars who read the primary book in the Hebrew scriptures, which is the story of Exodus, Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. And they say, there's really no historical evidence that this ever happened. And so, as you say, Aubrey, some people will then just say, oh, then it's a waste of time. Why even talk about it? Well, David thinks it didn't happen. But here's what he is interested in. Why would anybody tell that story? And why would anybody come up with the 10 Commandments? So he comes up with a theory. This can never be proven, right? This is one of those reasons my rabbi friend said, you don't want one interpretation that shuts down all the other ones, but here's one that's worth thinking about. He said, in all likelihood, the real genesis of the Jewish people was a group of tribes who lived in the Palestinian hill country. And they looked south and they saw the Egyptians with a big prosperous empire and lots of slavery. And they looked to the east and they saw the Assyrians, big prosperous empire with lots of slavery. And the Assyrians and the Egyptians and others, the Philistines were another group, would come and rob them all the time and try to take them over. And they're thinking, we don't want to be part of their empire. We like it the way we are. We like being these people who live without an empire ruling over us. We can grow our own crops and we don't. So they say, let's form an alliance of our 12 tribes. But if we're going to get along with each other, we need some set of rules of how we're going to do it. We've all got our different gods and all the rest. How about we tell a story about a God who sets people free from Egypt. And this is not a God of oppression who justifies slavery. This is a God of liberation. And, I could imagine people in the ancient world saying, look, they don't have science. It's not only that they don't have science, they don't even know there is such a thing as science. Yes. All they have is stories. Storytelling is their science. Storytelling science, storytelling psychology, storytelling sociology. Storytelling is their technology. And so they tell the story. And then they say, so let's make up our rules. What would the God of liberation tell us? And when he reads the Ten Commandments in that light, it's just magic. It's beautiful. I wrote back to him and I said, this is the best book I've ever read on the Ten Commandments. I felt he brought more wisdom and insight. Can I just give you a couple examples? I don't want to ramble on for too long.
No, yeah, please.
Okay, the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Interesting. And by the way, I'm going to guess that Latter-day Saints would read this differently than people from my background, right? But he says, so these 12 tribes, they believe in different gods, but they make an agreement. Let's have one God be the top God, and everybody else fits in underneath. So that's a way of saying we're allowing religious diversity, but it's a little bit like, Tim, the example you gave. We're never going to tell a story about a God who enslaves people. Our God is the God who liberates people, right? And so that's first commandment.
Wow, that's so interesting. Because that's one of those commandments that is just like, feels like that's the one that feels a little off. Like this God that's jealous and insecure. Like I love that way of framing it.
Yeah. And then okay, second one. You shall make unto me no graven image. And he imagines these people. And again, you can't prove this. Isn't the kind of thing you can clobber somebody over the head and say, you have to agree with me. He just throws it out there as a possibility. He says, you can imagine people with these poor little, indigenous tribes of the area looking at the rich colonizers coming in from all sides. And he says, they have really big temples, and their temples require a lot of money. And that money requires a lot of taxes and oppression. We don't want that. So we want a God. We just don't want temples and oppression. And so they say, so this God says, no idols, no graven images. And you say, well, hold it. How does that connect? Well, the way idols work in the ancient world is if you have an idol, somebody makes it. We know it's, somebody, we watched Fred, the idol maker, chipping away. It gets its power when the holy priests put it in a holy temple. It's like the temple activates the idol and the priests pull the magic from the idol. And so say, we're just going to nip this thing in the bud, no idols, which is the way of saying we don't want a religious industrial complex, right? Yeah. And he goes through each of the commandments and just reflects on why would people ever come up with something like this? And what I loved about it is instead of taking everything literally as if it's only legit, if it's historical, on the one hand, or throwing it out saying, it's just a bunch of stupid myths. Mm-hmm. He reads it respectfully and sees something quite powerful potentially going on there. So,
yeah.
What a beautiful example. Yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, no, please.
I just would love to hear if you have any other books. Like all 31 something thousand congregations will be studying the Old Testament this year. Are there other books that you would recommend that might help us get them, get something really useful out of this year of study?
So the best writer on the Hebrew scriptures that I always like to recommend is named Walter Brueggemann, Brueggemann, which sounds like a scholar's name. But he writes in ways that are really understandable to people. And many of his books are either about a certain genre of the Bible or a certain passage of the Bible. But Walter Brueggemann is my favorite writer about the Hebrew scriptures. And by the way, I'll just tell you something I don't judge anybody else for this, but I don't like to use the word Old Testament anymore or New Testament, even though I use them. I don't mean this legalistically, there's no religious scruple, but I'm aware that Christians have used the term Old Testament as their way of deriding the Jewish people. And I am so ashamed of the way members of my faith tradition have dehumanized the Jews, that I just don't like presenting, oh, we've got the New Testament and you're stuck with that trashy Old Testament. And there's another set of discussions we could have. I feel dirty when I use my text to make other people's texts be humiliated, right? Especially because, well, there's so much more we could say about that. But
so
Walter Brueggemann.
So you say Hebrew Bible, or is that your go-to, or do you have what do you call it?
I'll say the Jewish scriptures of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures, and because we all have our scriptures and they're important to us. Yeah. And I also think that Christians would be way better off if they listened to how Jews interpret their own text, because what Christians did is when they got a hold of the Hebrew scriptures, they just massacred them. I mean, as I say, my rabbi friend looks at the way Christians read the Hebrew scriptures and they just sort of shake their heads like, do you understand how ridiculous this looks to us to see the way you read these texts? So
thank you. That is so useful. That's so good to know. Yeah.
And Walter Brueggemann reads the Hebrew scriptures with that kind of respect, which I really appreciate. And if folks are interested, I wrote a book called We Make the Road by Walking, which is an attempt to read the whole biblical story, Hebrew scriptures, Christian scriptures, as a integrated narrative that in a respectful way, that might be useful to people. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. We've already taken way too much of your time, and thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us. The book that we mentioned earlier, The Great Spiritual Migration, to me, it's one of the most clear-eyed works that I've read on sort of the general subject of Christianity, and saying, while historically and currently there are some real problems, a lot of those are rooted in the Bible. And I think this may be a good place to end. You write, I believe, though, that there is a treasure at the heart of Christianity, a treasure worth saving. Could you maybe share what that treasure is to you?
Sure. Well, one of the terrible things that happens with sacred texts is people use them as a shortcut to being smart or to being wise or to being good. I know the Bible, so that makes me a holy person. I can quote the Bible. And I may have never had an original thought in my life. I maybe have never thought deeply in my life. But because I can quote a Bible verse, I suddenly think I'm smarter than everybody else. That to me is not the Bible being a treasure. But if in reading the Bible, I'm humbled, and if in reading the Bible, I'm faced with the complexities of life, and I'm brought to a place of deep humility, and a place where I think, we human beings are a hot mess, and we've been trying to work our way out of our problems and learn, wisdom. I would be an idiot not to try to get all the wisdom I can from the past. But I don't want to stop there. And the reason I like to think about the Bible as a library is when I read a library, when two different books in the library disagree with each other, I don't look at them as contradictions. I look at them as arguments. And one of the ways I can learn the most is by studying the arguments that have happened in the past and see how wisdom grew from those arguments. And if I then understand there are arguments going on in my day, how can I participate in the arguments of my day? And when I say arguments, I don't just mean people fighting with each other, but I mean us having problems that we don't know how to solve. We don't know what to do about climate change. We don't know what to do about the fact that rich people keep getting richer and richer and richer, and poor people have less and less left over them. We don't know what to do about the fact that people today are sucking up resources, and we're leaving a world for our children and grandchildren that will be impoverished because of our greed. And we have these discussions. What are we going to do about these problems? And then when I have humility to say, we've tried our best and made 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. How can I be a humble part of that? If it helps me put myself into my situation better. That to me is one of the many, many great treasures of having a holy, sacred text.
Wow, that was so beautifully played. Thank you so much. This has been really fruitful. I really appreciate all of your work here. Yeah.
Thank
and
you
for
so much,
taking
Brian.
more time. Thank you for taking time to be with us.
And honestly, just living a life that has taken you to a place where you can just share this type of wisdom with us. It's really just so invaluable. We can't thank you enough.
Well, thanks. So I think one of the other gifts of our texts at some point is when our texts let us down, or when we see how people abuse them.
Yeah.
That humbles us, and then we realize, we're all in this together. And that's how I feel. We're all in this together. So thank you for having me.
Same.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You guys ask such amazing, great questions, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Brian McLaren, and a big thanks to Brian for coming back on. If you'd like to hear more from Brian, head back to episode number 67, where we spoke with him about one of our favorite books, his book, Faith After Doubt. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we'd really love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.